you think it would take to say all the possible sentences in English that use exactly 20 words? Richard Lederer says that the enormous scale and complexity of generating all possible 20-word sentences in English is practically infinite. Assuming we have a vocabulary of 100,000 words, which it's a rough estimate, we allow for repetition of words, don't take into account grammar or syntax. The number of possible 20-word sentences is 100,000 raised to the power of 20. This is an extremely large number, approximately equal to 10 to the 140th power. To put this in perspective, the estimated number of atoms in the observable universe is around 10 to the 80th power. That creativity means that there are many, many ways of conveying the same message. There are two primary ways linguists talk about the fact that language varies. The first is to categorize the source of the varieties. For instance, linguists recognize that some differences reflect dialects of a single language, like English. There are three types of dialects. A temporal dialect is defined by a time in history. So the language of Shakespeare is different from today's English. A regional dialect is defined by a place. The English of my Midwestern family is different from that of my Southern in-laws, or the English of Australia is different from that of Scotland. As the map shows, ancient languages had different dialects too. A social dialect is defined by social groupings. The English of your grandmother is different from that of your teenage cousin. Another way to talk about social variation is called register, how language differs within specific situations or contexts. Your teenage cousin probably uses English differently when talking on the phone compared to texting. Linguists call that style shifting. Similarly, your own English in an academic paper probably differs from your English in a workplace email. Linguists usually call this type of variation a genre difference. It should be obvious that language is an important way to display our social identities. The second way linguists talk about variation is to categorize the levels of language at which variation can occur. I'm not going to go into detail here. My point is for you to grasp the range of variations that are possible in English or any language based on dialect or register or genre. At least from the 20th century on, linguists have talked about varieties of or variations in language with a focus on being scientific or descriptive. It's about observing what people actually do with no belief that one variety is always the best. The fact that there's a 40-year-old research journal titled World Englishes, yes, with a plural, is a compelling piece of evidence that linguists respect all varieties of all languages, including English. Let me try to make the distinction between a descriptive and a prescriptive attitude toward language more clear with a personal example. For many American English speakers, the word Coke means only the brand Coca-Cola. That's how I used the word for the first 20-some years of my life. But I found out that for some other American English speakers, like my in-laws who grew up in the southern U.S., the word Coke means any soft drink. After a misunderstanding at the grocery store, my husband prescribed that I use Coke to refer to all soft drinks when communicating with his family. But I still use the word Coke only for the brand with my own family because they follow a different standard. As an English speaker, I'm following a prescription that makes understanding more likely. As a linguist, I'm describing a variation in the way English is used by two groups of people without choosing which is better. Ultimately, to be a successful writer means recognizing that language variation is human, and it's also very useful. It allows us to work together to create impossible things. I want to show you this quote. It comes from a couple of linguists who specialize in American English dialects. They hit on one of the most commonly mentioned consequences of language variation. I mean, misunderstanding. But misunderstanding isn't the only consequence of that variation. Let me show you what I mean with some examples. In this example from a little earlier, I misunderstood the message sent by my in-laws because of a semantic difference in our regional dialects. But what's the consequence for readers in this next example? Assuming they're native English speakers from the US, it's doubtful many will misunderstand the message, even if it's not part of their own dialect. The consequence that's of more likely impact in this case is for the writer rather than the reader. Because y'all is specific to the dialect of the southern United States, that means it's often associated with lower social status. Science makes it clear that people judge others or make attributions about them based on relatively little information. That includes the language they use in a brief message. The writer who chooses y'all may be attributed with some negative qualities because of that one word. My main point here is that language variation can have negative consequences for both readers and writers. Let's consider one more example. Writers may choose the more descriptive synonym for engine oil here because they want to be more accurate or be perceived as more knowledgeable about what is accurate. But the consequences for readers, even if they don't misunderstand, is less efficient reading. That consequence might matter to the writer. Sometimes our own language preferences don't match what's best for our readers. Let me summarize some of the consequences of language variation. Here's a list of ways in which language variation in writing can affect a reader. The variants a writer chooses may affect reader comprehension and reading efficiency. I've mentioned these in several earlier examples. Readers also have feelings and attitudes that are influenced by language variations. For example, how frustrated do readers feel trying to find what they need because the writer used syntactic structure that makes the information less clear? Or how attracted are readers to the message based on the match between their own and the writer's dialects? When readers experience negative feelings and attitudes about a message, research tells us that they also lack trust in the writer, and that includes the organization the writer represents. Here's a list of ways in which language variation in writing can affect a writer, and since we're focused on workplace writers, that includes the organization they represent when they write. Conclusions about the writer or organization based on language variation are called attributions. Linguists have described the variant associated with higher status groups as unmarked or standard, and other variants as marked or non-standard. For instance, in the US, all of you is the unmarked second-person plural pronoun, and it'll go unnoticed by most readers. However, y'all is marked and likely to be noticed. Using marked variants increases the time it takes to process a message, and their use often results in negative attributions about the level of professionalism or the education level of the writer. Even if individual writers don't care about how linguistic outsiders perceive their language, the organizations writers represent usually do. Organizations adopt writing rules or standards to maintain consistency. That means writers who choose American spelling at work should consider the consequences of that choice if they work for a British organization. My point is that writers represent their employers at work, and that fact often requires that writers adopt language variants that aren't their own. Negative attributions about a writer affect their ability to get a job, and also their advancement after they get hired. Negative attributions about organizations affect their bottom line by influencing whether readers of their employees' writing want to do business with them. And finally, language variation can also create legal risk for the organization a writer represents. To be a successful writer or expert, you must be aware that the choices you make about the many possible ways of using English have consequences, not only for your readers, but also for you and for your organization.